So I'm Alex. I'm one of the interns here at Clags, and I'll be helping out with the tag.
Hi, I'm Liliana. I'm a PhD student here at the Grad Center. Welcome to the Trans Materialities panel. We have four very exciting speakers, and we have been instructed to just read the first sentence of their bios, but they all have these lovely bios. So you should read the whole bio, and it's on the website. If you go to the website, you can read the speakers' entire bios and learn about their work. So I'm going to introduce all the speakers, and then we'll sort of go in that order. So our first speaker is Drake Hansen. Drake is a first-year PhD student in American Studies at Penn State, Harrisburg, with an MA in folklore at Utah University. His work mainly centers objects of digital and material culture that resist serious attention. And then our second speaker is Koda Sokol. Koda Sokol is a visiting assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies at Davidson College. Koda's research and teaching focuses on the political import of emotion for gendered subject. And then our next speaker is Sydney Wilson. And Sydney is a PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of New Mexico. Her dissertation work is situated at the intersection of post-humanism, eco-criticism, and gender theory, focusing on corporeal manifestations of environmental crisis and the rupture of the human/non-human continuum in the 21st century Southern cone works of ego. And then Brynn Asher-Walker is our final speaker. Brynn, she is queer in every sense of the word and a passionate and compassionate artist, decolonizer, world maker, emergent strategist, and feminist killjoy who is messy AF and always looking for ways to subvert and transgress dominant culture and systems of power through everyday playful interventions. So thank you all so much for coming, and I will turn things over to Dick to start us off. Oh, and we'll have a Q&A at the end, so keep your questions in your mind.
All right, is this thing on?
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for that fantastic introduction. I'm going to steal my cup of water and hope that doesn't create problems later, but we'll all find out together. All right, and then just to make sure. Oh, is it working? Perfect. Across 3 videos from 2022, drag superstar Trixie Mattel makes essentially the same joke. In a video on her solo tour, Grown Up, she introduces her on-the-road living quarters. Welcome to where I live. Not as glamorous as you thought. Let me tell you one thing, okay? Tour bus, we're back in a mobile home, people. We're back in the trailer park, pretty much. In a video of her production trailer for the reality renovation show Trixie Motel, she says, "It's nicer than the hotel I grew up." Sorry, it's nicer than the trailer I grew up in. That's something. In a video backstage at the production Trixie and Katya Live, Mattel shows the tour buses. Quote, "You know, I grew up poor white trash in a trailer, and they don't tell you this. If you get too successful, guess what? They put you right back on a trailer. This is pretty much the size of the house I grew up in. At least this one moves." Each time Mattel makes this kind of joke, she does 2 seemingly oppositional things. First, she deflates her success as a performer by likening the accommodations of someone headlining stage and television shows with someone living in poverty. At the same time, she alludes to the scale of her achievements by noting her disadvantaged childhood. Trixie Mattel, who regularly introduces herself as a, quote, world-famous drag queen with a passion for makeup artistry, has built a successful multi-hyphenate career as an entertainer, musician, makeup magnate, comedian, resort owner, DJ, etc. Across her many projects, Mattel has often referenced her lower-class upbringing in rural Wisconsin, further emphasizing many of her groundbreaking achievements as a queer artist. In this Rags to Riches rise, Mattel's life exemplifies the most aspirational form of the American dream. In this paper, I consider how this dream narrative appears throughout Mattel's body of work, how Mattel uses the narrative in relation to her audiences, how it compares with canonical dream texts, and what these dynamics may suggest the American dream means for queer people in the United States. It seems the American dream exists in two contrasting forms. On the one hand is the United States as a land of opportunity where anyone might follow their passions to their version of success. On the other hand is a conformist notion where everyone aspires to suburban sprawl and strip malls, 2.5 kids and a white picket fence. In his monograph on the concept, Jim Cullen states that the American dream at its core is the belief that quote, in the United States, anything is possible if you want it badly enough. This belief reimagines the founding ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness into a promise for those who work hard enough. While these basic principles can be interpreted into any number of individual dreams based around individuals' definitions of happiness, the dream, TM or whatever, tends to coalesce around providing for the self and a family, achieving some kind of respect or renown and amassing wealth and property. From there, it can easily flatten into 2.5 kids, white, cis-het, suburban consumerism. Stories of this American mythology form a literary tradition. These dream narratives document success and or failure rather than just aspiration. Where fictional accounts often critique the dream and the gravity of conformity, nonfiction accounts tend to be memoirs of success. This discrepancy likely stems from survivorship bias. People whose dream collapsed aren't likely to get a book deal. Mattel presents an interesting case because, despite her broad success, the relatively novel realm of internet celebrity means it is being documented in real time, capturing more of the ups and downs. Unlike the canonized first-person American dream memoirs, such as Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, Mattel's accounts are not monolithic. Instead of being singularly written, they are multiple, fragmentary, and ongoing. Critically, they are presented through relatively unscripted video productions, generating thousands of hours of entertainment memoirs. Mattel is a prolific content creator. Her lived American dream is not her focus, but her content centers her life, so themes of her lived rags to riches success appear across a range of contexts. These themes reveal a more complex and granular picture of the emotional experience of success, as she might define it, than can be captured in a retrospective monograph, or even the more limited and curated texts associated with traditional celebrity. On the first episode of RuPaul's Drag Race Season 7, Trixie Mattel appears in a confessional interview introducing her family and her drag character during an opening runway challenge. Quote, "We grew up very, very poor, but Trixie, she has it all. The biggest problem in her life is what to wear the next day." Here, separating the concept of Mattel from the performer, Brian Firkus, Trixie Mattel is an aspirational caricature. At the most basic level, therefore, by creating and dressing up as this character, Mattel has always been performing an American dream narrative. She is becoming something other than how she was born, in particular, a coastal celebrity. Writing in 2003, Jim Cullen considers changing versions of the American dream across the history of the United States, ending with what he calls the dream of the coast, and its embodiment in California and celebrity culture. In an episode of Trixie Motel, Mattel notes, quote, "I always kind of base the energy of Trixie on California, chilled out and magical and beautiful and eternal summer." Cullen acknowledges the appeal, but is critical of this type of aspirational figure. Quote, "We have fun watching them have fun, and we almost believe that they really do represent us." Mattel, as a very literally self-made celebrity, argues that she can and does represent us, perhaps. Unlike traditional celebrity, where messy continuity between public and the private, the human and the symbol, where this messy continuity muddles the individual's ability to be a representative, there is much clearer separation between Trixie Mattel, the character, and her out-of-drag life. Trixie Mattel is a deliberate construct. Mattel explains her artistic intent. Quote, "With Trixie, I designed her to be a caricature of Americanized feminine beauty. The biggest lips, big hips, big boobs, long hair, big lashes. But I like using Trixie to parody that stuff. Women, especially, look at Trixie and go, the expectation of women is crazy, and Trixie is such a good little joke on that. On the other hand, they look at me being hyper feminine and they're like, being a woman is fucking fierce." That's the appeal. Mattel is simultaneously a locus of aspiration and a mockery of it. Mattel shows what we can be and how ridiculous it is. Mattel embodies both a critique of the American system and success within it. In 2024, Mattel achieved the pinnacle of the normative American dream, home ownership. Based on the success of the Trixie Motel and his accompanying television show, Mattel and then partner David Silver were able to purchase the house of their dreams. The process of buying and renovating this home was packaged and sold to the consumer as Trixie Motel Drag Me Home. This production files off some of Mattel's classic irony to capture more straightforward sincerity. Probably the most earnest and emotional moment in the show comes in a scene from the fourth episode, where Mattel and Silver pick out kitchen countertops. Silver surprises Mattel by revealing that he's already chosen rose quartz countertops, knowing they'd be her favorite, but she might be dissuaded by the cost. Mattel, flustered and overwhelmed, manages to confirm, quote, "We're getting precious stones for our house? You know I grew up in a trailer, right?" Mattel, being at a loss for words, heightens the emotional impact of the scene. She almost seems to be reliving the story of how she got to this point. By evoking that sense, Drag Me Home of all Mattel's work engages the most directly with the mythology of the American dream. She sums it up succinctly in a two-camera interview in the final episode. Quote, "This is the house we have always dreamed of. All the years of hard work, all the years of hard drag, it paid off." Unfortunately, sometime between the filming and airing of Trixie Motel Drag Me Home, Mattel and Silver separated. Details of their separation have not been shared publicly, but between that, her grueling work schedule, and potentially other events in her private life, Mattel became unwell. She took a 3-month break from drag shortly after the conclusion of Drag Me Home, her first significant break beyond an emergency appendectomy in her career. In both the lead up to and return from this break, Mattel shared with her audiences a number of reflections on her mindset and values, recognizing that fundamentally she overworked herself. Mattel explained, quote, "It's hard to say no when, like, you make more money than you could have ever imagined, and you're doing your favorite thing you could have ever imagined doing." In his description of The Dream of the Coast, Cullen argues that, quote, "For the beautiful people, a work ethic does not mean deferred gratification, but rather gratification through novel and exciting work that can be talked about on talk shows or in magazine stories, or work not tethered to a clock in the way that most American jobs are." As idyllic as such a lifestyle sounds, Mattel embodies how the lack of a tether also means the lack of guardrails. By being your own boss, there's no one to stop you from taking every opportunity. And with an uncertain future, why wouldn't you take every opportunity? Further, Mattel has admitted that her concern for an uncertain future is rooted in the financial instability of her upbringing. She says, I think obviously my weird, traumatized gay brain just cannot relax and cannot take a day off. And I think growing up, I'm not saying growing up rich is easy, but growing up poor can be very traumatizing, I think, very traumatizing. And I think my relationship with money and my sense of like, you have to make money now because it's on the table and you can't take a day off if there's a paycheck waiting for you. Like, that is not a healthy way to live. In speaking from her experience, Mattel problematizes the rags to riches story as much more than a neutral account of change in economic status through hard work. Our cultural veneration of wealth masks the costs of its attainment. Where much has been said about the exploitation of others in the pursuit of wealth, Mattel highlights the exploitation of the self. Her seemingly insatiable climb was rooted, in part, in trauma. Despite the substantial changes in economic status throughout her life and her strikingly unique career, Mattel pitches herself as a relatable figure. While many of her fans are still willing to accept that, some are beginning to question their relationships with her work. In late 2025, Mattel was invited to present a YouTube creator event. On an episode of her podcast with long-term collaborator Katya, The Bald and the Beautiful, she shares an interaction from the discussion after her presentation. Quote, "They did ask me an interesting question that I didn't have a good answer for in the moment. Somebody asked me if people like to watch you because they relate to you. And I said, I think so, right? They go, they've made you more successful. And so how do you manage being relatable to them, but then like appearing wealthier? But I think that minimizing or concealing that change in your life isn't honest and isn't a good place to start from." In isolation, this anecdote and the conversation that followed raises a compelling issue and suggests that Mattel has good instincts about her position. Unfortunately, it came at the end of a widely criticized episode of the podcast where nearly 25 minutes of its hour-long runtime were ad reads or sponsored content. Almost every comment in the YouTube upload of the podcast complains about the ratio of podcast to advertising, with one calling out the relatability conversation as demonstrating a striking lack of self-awareness. This is in contrast with comments on Mattel's videos from 2 to 5 years ago being overwhelmingly positive, framing Mattel as an inspirational figure to those commenters. Moving into 2026, she has continued to negotiate this instability in her work. In a February podcast episode, she referenced this trend in fan discourse while discussing a recent rectal surgery. You know what's sad? This is quoted. I'm complaining. I could afford a doctor. I could access care in America. So I don't want to complain. I still think I reserve some right to complain about my butthole being cut open. Please don't tear me apart in the comments for seeking care. Rich, out of touch. Trixie, rich, out of touch. In another episode of The Bald and the Beautiful, Mattel tried a different framing. Addressing co-host Katya, she said, "You're fearful for not having relatability." I'm like, so this is the gardening we're doing on the second patio. I don't care. The thing is, these, gesturing to the camera, are the primary shareholders of Trixie Mattel LLC, and I'm just telling them what happened to the money that I got from them watching this. To my reading, doing things like acknowledging the privilege of being able to afford healthcare is demonstrably not out of touch, but the conflicting perspectives raise a key question. Is it relatable and perhaps escapist to hear firsthand accounts from a radically different socioeconomic status or lifestyle, or is it alienating? What does the dream that Mattel has lived mean for the rest of us? The American dream is a potent and elusive mythology. The history of the United States is marked by people constructing and reconstructing this mythology. Throughout her unprecedented drag career, Trixie Mattel both deconstructs and reaffirms the mythology. She's able to present an unusually close look at herself using video and video sharing technology of the last few decades. This novel technological frame helps to create a sense of honesty and relatability. In this content, Mattel exemplifies inherent instabilities within the dream. Catalin Kiss, writing on queer imposter figures in US films, highlights that the American dream contains, quote, an inner tension between the ideal of the authentic individual regardless of class/status and that of socially sanctioned accomplishment and prosperity. This tension is especially salient for queer Americans, as rights and social acceptance are extended asymmetrically across the community. As scholar Mary Robertson reminds us, quote, it should not be surprising that white, middle class, and upper class, gay men and women fighting for a seat at the table with mainstream America might fare better than poor and working class queer people of color. In a country built on the mythology of the dream by white colonizers, the combination of whiteness and especially wealth goes a long way to outweigh the consequences of holding other marginalized identities. For all her ambivalence, Mattel may be most significant as a figure of queer success. By building a content empire of pink and glitter and dolls, she represents new possibilities for the queer community. Mattel states, when I started doing drag queens weren't even able to do what I'm doing. RuPaul hasn't done some of the things I've done, and so I never dreamed of any of this. Now that she has done those things, she has paved the way for other queer artists to dream of and beyond her success. By putting something out into the real world, it becomes even easier to dream whether that dream is American or not, and become more than anyone thought was possible. Thank you. Push the arrow keys one more time. Not that it worked, but perfect.
I actually didn't know that, so that was great.
Okay.
I don't know.
Koda.
Okay, hi everyone. Sorry I don't have a gorgeous slideshow. Sorry, but look at my face. So I'll be reading an excerpt of a chapter of the book that I'm working on. It's about 8% of the chapter. So there's a lot more to talk about, but this is just a piece that I'm excited to hear people's thoughts about. So the chapter is called Suffering for Solidarity, Trans-Jewish Organizing and the U.S. Anti-Zionist Movement. Can everyone hear me okay? While formal demographic data on the contemporary US-based Jewish anti-Zionist movement is virtually impossible to access, the observation of trans leadership in the movement is anecdotally corroborated both by those intimately involved as well as by the Zionists who oppose it. In this chapter, of which I'm reading a small excerpt, I explore the role that transness can play in enabling US-based Jews to interrupt sovereign Zionist victimhood and instead inhabit a non-sovereign vulnerability from which anti-colonial solidarities can flourish. Examining how sovereignty, victimhood, and vulnerability shape the political positions and horizons of trans-Jewish organizers can provide valuable insight not just for the anti-Zionist movement, but also for struggling collectively against racial capitalism, colonialism, and oppression more broadly. The ethno-nationalist settler colonial project of Zionism that maintains a hegemonic hold on US Jewish populations is a characteristic example of what I call sovereign victimhood. At the level of the sovereign nation state, Zionism responds to Jewish political injury by anchoring Jewish safety and self-determination to the state of Israel, whose militarized borders secure Jewish demographic majority and political authority through the systematic displacement, dispossession, and death of Palestinians. At the level of the sovereign individual, Zionism teaches Jewish subjects, regardless of where they reside, to experience themselves as perpetually under existential threat, in the form of Palestinian life and or anti-Zionism, from which only the militarized nation-state of Israel can protect them. At both the levels of state and subject, hegemonic Zionism treats exceptionalized political victimhood as a defining feature of Jewish life, such that the boundaries of the Israeli nation-state and the individual Jewish subject are experienced as categorically under siege and in need of defense. Given the hegemonic character of sovereign Zionist victimhood, it should come as no surprise that US Jews today identify remembering the Holocaust as the most essential element of being Jewish. Israeli historiography and Jewish historians in the US have for decades advanced an exceptionalized narrative of Holocaust victimhood that obfuscates both the diversity of groups persecuted by the Nazi regime, as well as the global history of racial colonialism. The Zionist narrative of Holocaust exceptionalism undergirds a sovereign victimhood position that asserts Jewish suffering as both discrete and more transhistorical than the suffering of other groups. Today, Zionist attachments to this Holocaust narrative and concomitant fear-mongering about ongoing anti-Semitism function to obfuscate both the contemporary structural privilege enjoyed by many US Jews, as well as the enormous economic, political, military, and cultural capital to which the state of Israel has access. While Jews today are racially and ethnically diverse, the majority of Jews, somewhere between 80 and 92%, identify as white and benefit from white supremacy, and on average, US Jews constitute a relatively high-income group. Moreover, Israel has enjoyed premier access to billions of dollars annually in military aid and unwavering political support from the US for decades. Rather than recognizing the structural power that Israel exercises over its identified political enemy, Zionists instead instrumentalize claims of Jewish victimhood to dehumanize this enemy as innately and existentially threatening, thus advancing the equation of Jewish sovereignty with the eradication of the Palestinian threat. Although dominant US Jewish organizations have been very successful at advancing a politics of sovereign Zionist victimhood, this hegemonic ideology is fragile, and the data demonstrates that it is beginning to crumble. Even prior to Israel's most recent genocidal campaign against Palestinians, younger generations of Jews were reportedly less attached to and more critical of Israel than their elders, and less likely to consider religion or Jewish identity important to them. With the egregious Israeli violence against Palestinians in Gaza between 2008 and 2014, and the new digital platforms for Palestinians to publicly narrate their ongoing dispossession and oppression, the image of Israel began to meaningfully transform in young US Jews' minds, particularly considering the likelihood of younger generations to get their information from social media. That these Zionist attacks against Palestinians occurred against a coterminous domestic backdrop of economic crisis and the Occupy movement, the ever-worsening climate disaster also created particularly ripe conditions for young people in the US to develop a political consciousness critical of interconnected colonial, racist, and capitalist forces. The massive upswell in anti-Zionist politicization among US Jews since October 2023 indicates a large-scale shift in critical consciousness, especially among younger Jews, that poses a real threat to Zionist hegemony. Over the last decade or so, feminist scholars and anti-Zionist organizers have also successfully raised the global public consciousness about Israel's use of pinkwashing to advance its brutal victimization of Palestinians by congratulating its assimilatory inclusion of some historically victimized, typically white and cisgender queer subjects. While prior to the mid-2010s, pinkwashing may have been a somewhat effective strategy for manufacturing Zionist consent among queer Jews in the US, today pinkwashing is a widely recognizable object of critique through which trans Jews in particular are actually coming into anti-Zionist consciousness. I argue that the constrained scope of trans homonationalism and the effectiveness of anti-pinkwashing activism have established the political possibility for trans people specifically to feel excluded from or misaligned with sovereign Zionist victimhood. This rings especially true in the US today, as increasingly intense vitriolic attacks diminish the limited social freedoms, healthcare, and welfare to which trans populations may have had access. Pinkwashing seeks to curry sympathy for Israeli colonial violence by promising protection and assimilation for historically victimized queer subjects. However, when discussing their initial encounters with pinkwashing, many of the trans Jewish organizers that I interviewed described feeling not sympathy but disgust and horror, which produced an impulse to recoil from Zionism. Leo, for example, says he reacted to pinkwashing by, quote, feeling like my safety as a Jew is weaponized and my safety as a queer person is weaponized, and so that feels horrifying. Reiterating the horror that Leo feels at this Zionist weaponization, Jay describes having, quote, such a gut reaction of disgust and horror to seeing her queer, trans, and Jewish identities weaponized, identities that have, quote, been important to my experience and a place of marginalization that has taught me a lot. The disgust unifying these organizers' reaction to pinkwashing stems from, as Jay says, their ability to locate themselves in it. These interviewees could see and feel the ways in which their historically victimized queer, trans, and Jewish identities were being strategically weaponized toward violent ends. Sarah Ahmed describes disgust as the feeling when contact has an unpleasant intensity. The object is too close, so the body recoils and pulls away. Quote, to be disgusted is, after all, to be affected by what one has rejected. Feeling one's queer, trans, and Jewish identities be brought into intimate proximity with a violent politic can understandably produce a feeling of disgust, a desire to recoil that does not simply motivate a pulling away from Zionism, but also a moving toward anti-Zionism. Jay, for example, was motivated by her disgust with pinkwashing to begin organizing in a queer, trans, anti-pinkwashing collective, an organizing experience which taught her that, quote, we can only understand gender meaningfully through understanding colonialism and imperialism, and of course the only gender freedom we can fight for is one that is global. The disgust with pinkwashing described by these organizers demonstrates how feeling a personal stake in political struggle can move one away from a position of discrete sovereign victimhood and toward an understanding of intersubjective non-sovereign vulnerability. Many of the interviewees came to feel the relevance of their trans experiences to anti-Zionist political struggle through developing an anti-colonial politic that draws connections between the violent technologies of colonialism, capitalism, and gender normativity. Trans feminine organizer Isha, for example, describes how trans Jews might intuitively come to connect these colonial dots through personal experiences of living under and being victimized by necropolitical anti-trans conditions in the US. Residing in a conservative southern state in which trans people have been holistically disenfranchised, Isha says, quote, as a trans person, I feel the effects of a government in a state that wants to erase us, that wants us not to exist. For Isha, knowing how it feels to be victimized by state violence, quote, makes it really much simpler for me to see when that's happening to other people. As Isha and other interviewees elaborate, one concrete example of these transnational colonial entanglements is that the medications trans people in the US are typically prescribed for hormone replacement therapy are produced by the Israeli corporation Teva Pharmaceutical Industries, and pharmacies tend not to offer alternative manufacturers. In naming this specific entanglement that trans people experience, the interviewees expressed disgust and frustration at feeling forced to choose between life-affirming medications and solidarity with Palestinian calls to boycott Israeli corporations. In the words of trans feminine Jewish organizer Ita, a large part of the trans community in the US is being forced to choose between our life-affirming transitions and our Palestinian siblings' demand for freedom. Trans Jewish organizers extrapolate from entanglements like this that the anti-trans conditions to which they are subject in the US are a symptom of the same capitalist colonial machine responsible for Israeli genocidal violence against Palestinians, and that this personal stake motivates their collective anti-colonial action. Such an anti-colonial politic interrupts the sovereign Zionist fantasy of discrete an exceptional Jewish Israeli victimhood in its insistence upon a transnational understanding of power and violence and its divestment from settler colonial promise of militarized national security. For white organizers, transness is particularly relevant as a catalyst for transnational anti-colonial politicization, insofar as benefiting from white supremacy can impede people's ability to recognize structural violence and feel invested in an alternative, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist future. White people are, in Leo's words, less likely to feel any actual sense of solidarity or desire to leave the position you're in. To be clear, identifying as trans alone is not a sufficient precondition for developing an anti-colonial critical consciousness, especially for white people. What is more, an over-identification with one's trans victimhood can actually be, in organizer Laser's estimation, an insidious means of, quote, distancing oneself from their whiteness for the sake of disavowing structural power and thus obfuscating or legitimizing abuses of that power. What I'm arguing then is that transness has the capacity to interrupt white attachments to racist structures, including Zionism, by teaching people to detect and pursue an anticipatory illumination of an otherwise future. Trans experiences can prepare people to, in Laser's words, believe in something that they can't see, to expand the way that they think the world works outside of what they can see and what they can pin down and understand. Experiences of transness require people to believe in and enact a version of themselves that differs fundamentally from a previous self-understanding and from normative meaning-making schemas. By prompting a questioning, unlearning, and reimagining of compulsory norms and fantasies at an intimate scale, transness can support a process of self-recognition within an anti-colonial framework that misaligns with and unsettles sovereign Zionist victimhood. As these interviewees attest, experiences of trans-political victimhood can be metabolized into sources of anti-colonial consciousness development and solidarity, rather than interpreted as discrete or exceptional forms of suffering. In contrast to sovereign victimhood, wherein people identify as wounded in a fixed or essentializing way, the interviewees embrace what I refer to as non-sovereign vulnerability, a recognition of our collective, unequal, and shifting exposures to wounding, and by consequence, our fundamental interdependence. Non-sovereign vulnerability acknowledges that while people are differently exposed to harm, vulnerability does not inhere in a particular body or identity, but is instead produced dynamically by structures and regimes of power. Through this non-sovereign orientation toward vulnerability, trans Jews learn not only to refuse the sovereign Zionist fantasy of discrete and exceptionalized Jewish suffering, but also to recognize trans liberation as fundamentally bound up with transnational anti-colonial movements. The non-sovereign vulnerability embraced by these trans-Jewish organizers can be understood as an enactment of the, quote, partial dissolution of sovereignty into desire, for which political theorist Wendy Brown calls in the conclusion of Wounded Attachments. Critiquing the way that politicized identity can become attached to its own suffering and thus sustain the structures that produce this suffering, Brown wonders about the possibility of shifting political expression and claims away from being and toward wanting. Sovereign Zionist victimhood, a position which serves to justify Israel's ongoing colonial violence, is a particularly insidious manifestation of a wounded attachment, an attachment to one's own suffering that maintains the violent systems that produced it in the first place. By contrast, non-sovereign vulnerability treats Jewish suffering as fundamentally unexceptional, neither the worst form of political harm nor one that can be understood as separate from ongoing histories and structures of racial colonialism and capitalism. Beyond avoiding a fixation on Jewish suffering, this non-sovereign vulnerability makes possible an anti-Zionist Judaism that is fundamentally animated by a desire for safety in and as anti-colonial futurity. When describing his desire for the future of liberatory social movements, Leo expresses his hope for the possibility of, quote, living in your humanity within the constant crisis and the constant violence, and not being defined by it, and also not looking away from it. This hope reflects the shift Brown calls for, a shift from being defined by victimhood and fixed in cycles of trauma toward treating wounding as a desire for something else. In contrast to the annihilatory impulse produced by Zionist wounded attachments, the non-sovereign orientation toward vulnerability expressed by Leo and others is a position animated by the desire to, quote, experience joy and love and pleasure as much as possible. Thank you.
Yes. This is yeah. Yeah, actually, you actually waited. Oh, you go. And then start. Did I?
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So just to preface, this is a definite variation of what we've been doing. So I'm much more focused on literature analysis and literary analysis. So this is situated within that context, just to clarify. But this is called Mourning at the Margins, Queerness, Class and Resistance in Una Mujer Fantástica, which is a very lovely Chilean film from 2017 by Sebastián Lelio. So Sebastián Leleo's Una Mujer Fantástica begins with what appears to be a private tragedy. The sudden death of Orlando, Marina, our trans feminine protagonist, her older partner. And the film's official synopsis identifies Marina as a young waitress and an aspiring singer. There's some interesting kind of specificities about her singing, and it's kind of a pseudo burlesque, but it's that kind of showgirl, so to speak, that she is. And it's made clear that after Orlando dies, she is met not with compassion, but with suspicion from doctors, police, and his family. What follows is not simply a narrative of grief, nor just a story about transgender visibility. Although the film has definitely received a lot of recognition regarding the trans feminine protagonist, I suggest that reading it primarily as a film about trans visibility is not enough, and that it offers a critique of how gender, class, and power, institutionalized power, intersect in contemporary Chile. And more specifically, I argue that Marina's mourning is shaped as much by class hierarchy as it is by transphobia and misogyny, or transmisogyny. And her grief is not only personal, it is political at its core. And this film shows that the right to mourn and the right to remain in shared spaces and the right to be recognized as someone's loved ones is socially distributed rather than universally granted. So this distinction becomes clear immediately after Orlando's sudden death. Marina is not allowed to occupy the role of the grieving partner in any way. She's immediately treated as a suspect, both when she takes him to the hospital and the police question her, and then she's further humiliated by his family, who was more or less unaware of her existence. So these acts are not separate incidences, right? She's displaced from the department, she's banned from the funeral, she's denied access to the car that they were sharing. These are all sequences of events that are interconnected forms of erasure, situated within grief. They reveal that Marina's exclusion is produced at the intersection of transmisogyny and classism, and that the lingering authoritarian logics of Chilean institutions are working to exclude her from this. At the same time, however, the film does not reduce Marina to victimhood. It offers moments of defiance and persistence that suggest another way of imagining queer survival. It's not an assimilation into dominant norms, but a struggle to remain present in a world structured to deny one's reality. So the film's title in itself has, to me, a very specific meaning, right? In English, a fantastic woman. It sounds very celebratory, it sounds very positive. But in Spanish, there is a different translation, right? Fantástica can be fantastic, but it can also mean something that's fictional, something that's surreal, something that is abnormal, for lack of a better word, right? So this ambiguity of the title matters. Marina is fantastic, not only in the sense that the film affirms her dignity, but also in the sense that the social world around her repeatedly treats her as if she were somehow unreal. She's an impossible woman, an illegitimate partner, a presence that can be disavowed. The tension built into the title reflects the film's central premise. Marina is not only fighting for respect, she's fighting for legitimacy, social reality, and the right not to be treated as fictional in the wake of his death. To develop this argument, I draw first on intersectional feminism, specifically intersectional trans feminism, with the idea of intersectionality, right? She is not marginalized along one axis alone. She's a trans woman, but she's also working class, feminized, and she's precarious in relation to property and owning property. And she's further exposed in institutions that do not treat her as fully legitimate. A trans feminist reading helps clarify that the violence she experiences is not reducible to transphobia in the abstract, but what is at stake specifically is the vulnerability of a trans feminine subject whose womanhood is denied and whose femininity is treated as suspect, theatrical, and or fraudulent. That is why trans misogyny is such an important concept here. She's not only punished for crossing gender norms, but it's for inhabiting femininity outside the terms that patriarchal society deemed acceptable. A second framework is territorial feminisms. It's mostly coming out of Latin America. You see it a lot in Mexican works nowadays. There's the concept of cuerpo territorio, or body territory. This framework to me is useful, one, because, as you mentioned in my introduction, I'm mostly focused on eco-horror and this kind of connection between the human and the environment. And this strain of feminism, we can call it, suggests basically the same thing, that the sovereignty of the woman is fully connected to the sovereignty of the land. Extractivism, things like that are both an assault on the land and an assault on women, which is often taken back to, there are several like Liliana Valvano that refer to the colonization of the Americas as the first rape, both of the land and of the people. It kind of dates back to that kind of symbolism. This perspective also helps us think ecologically, though in a very modest way. I'm not at all arguing that this film is ecological or environmental, but rather territorial feminism helps us to see how the spaces Marina moves through, whether that's the apartment, the hospital, the funeral home, etc., are not neutral settings. They're territories in which legitimacy is distributed unevenly. Marina's body is constantly made to feel out of place in those spaces, as if she were trespassing in a social order that was not designed for her. Her struggle is therefore also a struggle over spatial belonging and spatial righteousness, essentially. I also want to briefly bring in Akile Mbembe, not necropolitics, I know, throwing everyone off, but actually his critique of Black reason, which kind of breaks down where this idea of Black personhood comes from and this kind of marginalization, its roots in the slave trade and moving on. But I think this helps us think about how systems that sort bodies into differential categories of worth, humanity, and disposability. I'm not attempting to collapse anti-trans violence into other forms of oppression such as racism, but I think this language that he uses is useful for understanding how power operates by assigning some bodies to be fully human and others to a zone of suspicion, regulation, and reduced legitimacy. In Marina's case, the film reveals a gendered hierarchy of humanity. Again and again, she's treated not as an ordinary grieving subject, but as something questionable, improper, or less real. In that sense, the film critiques a broader social order in which human recognition remains conditional and stratified. This critique becomes particularly resonant in the context of the post-dictatorship and this kind of democratization of Chile. The transition to democracy did not at all fully dismantle the authoritarian habits, beliefs, people that upheld this, right? And the democratic present remains marked, very much so, by the unresolved histories of violence and neoliberal restructuring and institutional mistrust. When reading the film in that context, Marina's treatment by the police and medical authorities doesn't actually appear as simply interpersonal prejudice. It becomes legible as part of a longer historical continuity in which certain bodies are subjected to scrutiny, discipline, and exclusion more readily than others. Una Mujer Fantástica is therefore not only about contemporary transphobia, it also gestures towards the afterlives of authoritarianism in everyday social and institutional life. The first major terrain on which this becomes visible is the mourning aspect, right? The hospital scene is particularly important because it shows how Marina's grief is denied and directly in the aftermath of his death. It was from natural causes, just to clarify, she did not kill him, in case that was at all not clear. She was completely innocent. After he collapses and she rushes him to the emergency room, she, in theory, should be occupying the role of an intimate partner, the person that is closest to him, his partner for an extended period of time at this point. But instead, she's immediately displaced from that role And the emotional logic of the scene is interrupted by the bureaucratic and institutional suspicion that is casted towards her. She's not embraced as a mourner, but she's repositioned as someone who must explain herself. The shift is devastating precisely because it happens at the moment when grief should be the most recognizable. The film shows that mourning is not simply a natural emotional response, it is a social status that must be granted or conferred upon someone. Marina feels grief, but the world around her refuses to ratify it. That refusal intensifies once Orlando's family enters the picture. The scenes with Sonia and Bruno, his siblings, are painful not only because of their cruelty, but because they reveal how kinship and class work together to police grief. When Marina is confronted in the parking garage and told she should stay away, the family is not simply insulting her, but they are beginning the work of rewriting Orlando's life without her in it. This effort becomes even more explicit in the struggle over the apartment and the car. These objects are not just simply his material possessions, but they are evidence of a shared world, proof that Marina and Orlando had built routines, intimacies, and forms of dependence together. When she is denied the car and pushed out of the apartment, she's being dispossessed not only economically, but symbolically. The family's class power allows them to control the narrative of legitimacy. Because they possess wealth, status, and normative familial authority, they are able to decide whose attachment counts and whose does not. This is why class hierarchy is central to the film. Marina is a waitress and nightclub singer. Orlando's family inhabits a different social world, one marked by greater economic security and confidence. Their transphobia does not operate independently of this class position, but is simply reinforced by it. They have the power to transform prejudice into material exclusion. They can remove Marina from the apartment, deny her access to the car, block her memory, and her respectability. The film therefore suggests that mourning is structured through economic power. Marina's grief becomes unrecognizable not only because she is trans, but because she lacks the class authority to defend her claim to Orlando's life. The sauna key sequence is a really important scene if you've ever seen it, but Marina finds a key in his things and belongings, and she follows it in search of what she could find, expecting it to be like this final hidden remainder of what's left of him, right? This other part of him that she's never been able to access before. But when she opens the locker, it's empty. This emptiness is deeply significant because it dramatizes her mourning as a search for access to memory, to knowledge, and to that final goodbye. Yet what she finds is just another void. The emptiness of the locker mirrors the social structure of the film itself. Again and again, she reaches towards spaces that should have been shared or available to her, only to discover that she's been cut off from them. This scene makes loss feel not only emotional, but spatial. Okay, right in the context of post-dictatorship Chile, this scene also evokes the persistence of authoritarian habits. The violence that she consistently encounters in all forms is authoritative, and it's administrative rather than spectacular, but it's no less invasive for that reason. The film further suggests that democracy is not fully abandoned older techniques of surveillance and classification. Instead, because like in many dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, trans people, queer bodies were persecuted, of course, as is just about everyone. But instead, these techniques live on in softer but still coercive forms. Marina's body becomes readable to the institution only through its forced exposure by the medical professionals. And in this sense, the film connects anti-trans violence to a broader history of state power in which certain bodies are presumed available for examination and control. So, to conclude, I want to suggest that Una Mujer Fantástica should be understood not only as a film about trans identity, but as a film about the politics of reality itself. What can be negated, what can be validated, what can be conferred upon another. It asks who gets to count as real, whose love is publicly recognized, whose grief is socially authorized, and whose body is allowed to occupy space without suspicion. Marina's mourning is shaped by the intersection of transphobia, misogyny, class hierarchy, and institutional violence. Her exclusion from Orlando's apartment, car, funeral, and memory reveals that grief is never purely private. It is mediated by property, respectability, and the social distribution of legitimacy. At the same time, the film refuses the fantasy of Marina's erasure. It shows that what is truly fictional is not her womanhood, but the violent social fiction that she can be denied reality and made to disappear. In that sense, Una Mujer Fantástica is not simply a story of suffering, it is a critique of the structures that produce marginality and a mediation on queer persistence in the face of dispossession. Marina remains in voice, movement, grief, and in her refusal. The film's Marina remains in many ways, and that refusal to disappear is the film's most powerful form of resistance. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brynn. Yeah, my first act of subversion is sitting over here.
Yeah.
My second act of subversion is that this started out as a much more normal research paper and has become a poem over the course of this last while that I've discovered that's how I write. And it's also called Poor Queer Play or Surviving Self-Actualization. You can write your way out of anywhere, said the great Eve Pisaki Sedgwick by way of Matt Grimm, who provoked me to sit with and sing the queer girl blues, writing my way out of anywhere. When I first read that, I was so inspired. It's the kind of quote you can really drink in until you're intoxicated with its slow poison. In the theater, that's the land I came from long ago, it seems to me now, people say these deep things, and by people I mean elders, which in the theater means celebrities and pedagogues. I wasn't there, but I've heard tell that Ellen Burstyn once said in session at the Actors Studio, you just have to find the magic. And everyone was filled with meaning. These turns of phrase really did it for me for a while, until I realized what they mean. You really can write your way out of anywhere, and that's how I have found the magic. I have written myself out of existence and into utter obliteration. I used to be stuck inside an imaginary closet made with very firmly constructed walls separating me from my body, mind, spirit at birth. I was assigned dispossessed, disenfranchised, and disincarnated, held at arm's length from my own life, peering out from within at a perpetual distance. I wrote my way out of that mess. It took me the last 8 years of deeply committed care and several educational programs that I used to unlearn everything I could think of, including myself. Decolonization is not a metaphor, said Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Wang. I wrote a whole unpublished book about decolonizing my body, mind, spirit as my MA thesis in applied theater. I have been joking lately in all seriousness about making an escape room for queer folks to escape white cis heteropatriarchy. It could be a playful museum installation. I don't know why I'm so obsessed with play. Lee Edelman tells me it's my death drive speaking, needing some sense of perpetual jouissance, stepping sideways into the moment. In theory and pedagogy, acting is the practice of being in the moment. And role play is about trying on new ways of living and being and seeing for a time. I used to love getting lost. I would get in my car and drive to nowhere. It was more fun when I didn't have a honing beacon in front of my face at all times. I had not been swallowed by our technopoly back then. For reference, a technopoly is when the tools we think we use, in fact, use us as these convenient devices literally control our central nervous systems. I'm lucky, I suppose, though luck is slippery. Some folks luck their way into millions of dollars, and some luck their way into mountains of debt. While systems of money and gender are just social constructs, risking major life changes to binary codes invites side effects. I looked my way into a job teaching in the ivory tower of NYU Tisch. Correction, I looked my way into a situationship where I get to explore my own love of play with the best and the brightest of the next generation, and I give them tools to disavow their programming of privilege and entitlement for a time. That's the kind of thing you can do as a teacher with folks who glorify the starving artist and think ramen equates to roughing it. Roughing it in my life was an entire year where all I ate were peanut butter and marmalade sandwiches because marmalade is cheaper than jam and jelly. I would get 1 jar of each and a bag of bread. That was my meal, every meal for a week. But I could always afford play. That's how lucky I was. It made me sick. I ate sometimes as a child. I usually had to feast and famine on whatever scraps others didn't finish after I couldn't look at one more bag of popcorn or Kraft macaroni and cheese without vomiting my soul, but that's what my single mother could afford most of the time. I finally got fed up with it all one day and wrote myself out of these nightmares and into a whole host of new ones. I finally got a credit card in my mid-30s thinking I had really graduated into something, and I went back to school after I hit rock bottom because the restaurant industry morphed one day into the face of hospitality. I was too neurospicy and queer and depressed to take in the question, "How are you?" without spiraling for the rest of the day.
Right.
In restaurants, everyone wants to pretend to know how you are in every single fucking interaction. That's the machinery at work. I wrote myself out of that mess and went back to school in my late 30s when I figured I had nothing else to lose because I was tired of being the most trained performer in any room I walked into without being able to teach. I was terrified when I arrived at Hunter College because I couldn't read when I was younger. I taught myself to actually retain information by reading plays out loud with friends, but I had never play tested that theory with a book on my own, or I had, I suppose. It didn't work out. My greatest luck in life was the pandemic because I knew how to starve and be alone from many years of unemployment, and it was just more of the same with different people dying for different reasons. That was a time when I really enjoyed the suffering of others. It made me feel less alone. There's no way I could pay for school, but that's not a new problem in the world, and I was taken in by free college in New York until I found out it's only available to those who have only taken up to 1 year off of their educations. My therapist wrote me a letter as to why my severe poverty and trauma and dysphoria and disabilities made it impossible for me to finish or even do well in my first foray of learning at 4 community colleges. Until I gave up that ghost about 20 years before, because that's how unstable my food and housing situation was, and degrees meant nothing to me. I didn't want to give myself a backup plan because I knew I'd take anything over nothing, but art was the only thing that was always available and fed my spirit while my body and mind starved. I figured that a lifetime of debt was worth a single moment more of total obliteration and obsolescence. I was still living in a world that was no longer viable. Perhaps I was dying, but we are all dying. I was a caregiver then for a stage 4 cancer patient who was my beard, I guess, in the most unhappy marriage I couldn't deal with anymore, death, until she passed away. 2 things I have always been are a teacher and a researcher. These are the benefits of autism. That have been my superpower that has mostly alienated others. I do embodied research, that's what I like to call it anyway, and then I try to support it with any piece of writing I can find to validate what I already know. I had a whole piece of writing in mind, and I'll probably get to writing it eventually, except I've fallen out of love with academia. Bell Hooks said that education is the practice of freedom, and that's true if you can afford it. The broke folks I play with don't give a shit about decolonizing. They're too busy trying to assimilate and make ends meet. This is my vulgar scholarship. I was going to write something pretty and expected. I'm extracting and abstracting from the academy instead. I have written myself into total obscurity. Eve talks about getting out, which is the death knell for inmates. Why would it be any different for us? I was a prisoner of the closet, protesting my complicity until I finally stopped fighting and working within the system until I got my parole, but the officer is still there in my head. This is all metaphorical, if you're wondering, but it seems like an apt comparison for those of us who benefit off the backs of prison labor that furnishes this institution for 3 to 14 cents an hour. Ever wonder why public schools are so affordable? We all have Chlorcraft to thank for that. Does that make us colonizers? What is the true price of this education? Is this really a practice of enslavement? I will be shackled by debt for the rest of my life. They finally got me. I have written myself out of a very special kind of hell, and my day-to-day life as a trans girl in America in perpetual queer adolescence is fucking amazing. If I don't think about our current socio-political nightmare, the dual state I pay into, or the icy slave catchers terrorizing the streets that belong to none of us, including them. Every day, I write myself more and more out of relevance to the machinery of practicality. I've written my way into queer euphoria and years of PhD rejections after catching the academic bug from the Ronald E. McNair Scholars Program, who sparked my misadventures through multiple graduate programs and believed in me back when I was still institutionalized enough to be given the Majian gift of fair weather respectability, drinking the snake oil Kool-Aid of colonized freedom dreams. Polemics are my style of poor queer play, the magical stuff that feeds me, that costs nothing and is worth nothing to the powers that be. But where's the hope in that? What is there to live for? We want to cruise utopia, damn it. Where's my queer Hollywood future designed by Jose Esteban Munoz? I'm sorry to be the feminist killjoy to break up the news about Santa or something, but utopia is not on the horizon. It probably never will be. They won't be serving it up at the Clogs after party. That's the dream. Don't get me wrong, I love me some Dr. King too. It's a nice soundbite that floats around in my brain along with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was initially prosperity, but no one wanted to promise that. Happiness is more reasonable. But you can write your way out of anywhere, right? Maybe for a while, but I can't write my way out of poverty or oppression or rape culture or the transphobia that is legislated onto our bodies and drags daily on our spirits, or dare I say souls. You can't write your way into class mobility simply by doing one more graduate program, though I've tried. We can't write a new future for ourselves or some theoretical child that anyone is going to live in. This poetry is not going to change policy. That's an intergenerational fantasy of civil rights that the Democratic Party is still grasping onto for dear life. Maybe they should, because I love that hope porn as much as the next queer, and it's better than just giving up the ghost to the manosphere. But that's never been the path for us here in the underclass. We are the sad proletariat, and our power is the pain and pleasure of alienated labor, the work we put into what we care about. When I spend my whole day fighting oppression against whatever internalized demons still have their teeth sunk into me, that shit feels good, don't it? That's the real stuff right there. I get high on that. When I interrupt the machine of cishet patriarchy and stage an intervention in the middle of someone's sentence who was just giving me their piece of their hive mind about the rules, or even just some unsolicited advice because they're real friendly and I don't know any better because I'm femme in America or whatever other good reason, because men are at work and we must all make way because the sign says so and that's what you do. When I shut down that MAGA mouthpiece, that's a special kind of bliss. That's the queer play I'm talking about. That's how you do it on Survivor. Because Jeff Probst can woke up a game for $1 million on national TV, so can we. This is just a game that we're living and dying in. The rules are all made up to serve them anyway. And we've got to get over this incessant search looking for validation in everyone's face. Because then we would be enough if only their greed agrees. I left the theater because I hate agreement. I got sick of the farce of Eurocentric democracy, the same high culture that left women and slaves out of literally everything in society, the same way our Constitution is and always will be by and for men. Even if they add words to appease the masses, it's like the under God eye roll moment in the Pledge of Allegiance. We don't need reasons to hope. Hope is a basic function of being alive. They give us reasons to get our buy-in for their version of aliveness. But we know better than that. We left that simulation long ago. In the queer present moment, the one we've worked so hard for, suffering is its own kind of peace. It hurts a lot to be alive. The only painless things are death and escapism. When poor queers play with reality despite a total lack of practicality, even though everything sucks, that is the real power trip. We wrote our way out of order, directly into a whole queer mess. This is subversive life in the morass, baby. That examined life worth living for. Every other alternative is death. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. That was absolutely incredible. So we have 9 minutes of Q&A. So if anyone has questions, raise your hands and our lovely people can answer them. We can also take 10 minutes to do other things and wrap up here. People don't have questions or people can talk with one another. So if anyone otherwise, okay, then we will wrap up here. Thank you all so much. And thank you everything. Is that written finger that others can resist? But let's